ELI5 If inflation is continuous year on year, how does that become tenable over say 100-200 years? I was living in a country that experienced hyperinflation for a long period of time. Basically, it goes like this: things become more expensive, wages catch up, and sometimes, since no one wants a starving population, new wave of inflation happens, and so on. When everyone starts earning hundreds of millions, state removes several zeros from the currency and issues new money, giving some grace period to spend or exchange savings. Rinse and repeat. I've seen at least 4 different currencies in one lifetime. With more stable currencies, the same thing should happen, but it takes much longer. The numbers don't really matter. What matters is how much a good service is as a percentage of the median income. For a more personalized view, you could compare to your personal or household income. Wages have been rising faster than inflation since February. Prior to that they were lagging. I don't only assume that the same dynamic will happen in the future. At some points goods and services will be relatively more expensive, at other points they'll be relatively inexpensive. Don't focus on the absolute cost of bread. It's better to think of those things on terms of percentages. This is a bit far past ELI5 levels, but you Peruvian bull has a lovely series of essays and/or videos describing how the massive debt levels at easy credit and free lending over the last 50 years since Nixon took us off the gold standard has reached the event horizon. The US national debt will inevitably drive money printing until it compounds and inflates away the US dollar into irrelevancy. No fiat currency has ever survived, which is why many are turning to gold, land, other investments and hard-capped crypto as alternatives. The reason inflation has to happen is because the alternative, deflation, is worse. Imagine you take out an interest-free loan for 10 years. You pay the $200 a month for the loan. In 10 years that $200 has less buying power than it used to. But if you have deflation, the loan goes the other way. That $200 now has more buying power than it used to. This is the issue with deflation. There's no longer such a thing as an attractive loan, and if they do charge interest, then it really balloons out of control when currency deflates. It doesn't matter. If salaries go up at the same rate or better than inflation, you will be able to buy just as much or more stuff than you can today. You're right that little bits of inflation add up over the years. In fact, cumulative inflation over the last 100 years has added up to almost 3,000, yet houses are larger than they were back then and people are buying more stuff than ever. There's not really any reason moderate inflation over long periods can cause a problem. Wages do rise with inflation, and in the United States wages typically rise faster than inflation. Now usually it's lumpy. Inflation happens and people are stretched thin because wages don't rise immediately. Then eventually inflation dies down and wage increases outpace inflation. Between 2010 and 2020 inflation was below 2. But if every year you got a 3 raise, you were 1 richer each year. You gave some of that back with the high inflation of the last 2 years, but overall you're likely better off than you were. Because as inflation happens, people's income also inflates. Imagine if, 100 years from now, something costs 40x as much as they do today. But also imagine that people are making 50x as much as they do today. The effect in this case would be that the thing would be cheaper for them measured as a smaller part of their income. On the other hand, if that something costs 50x as much as it does today and people are making 40x as much, it becomes less affordable as it takes a bigger part of their income to buy it. Wages typically rise faster than inflation, or at least they did over the 20th century. Sometimes it's because factory workers negotiate a good pay deal. Sometimes it's because more people are becoming well-paid tech workers rather than low-paid factory workers. If that's not happening at the moment, well, that's a problem. Maybe it will keep happening and we'll keep getting poorer, or maybe it's just a temporary blip caused by recent disruptions to the supply chain by war, pandemic, etc. Take into consideration stuff like world or civil wars, too. But it's not so clear-cut as much or more stuff than you can today. You're right that little bits of inflation add up over the years. In fact, cumulative inflation over the last 100 years has added up to almost 3,000, yet houses are larger than they were back then and people are buying more stuff than ever. There's not really any reason moderate inflation over long periods can cause a problem. Yes, you're exactly right. The plan is to enslave the entire population of the planet. That's why it's now immoral to have children. You're signing them up for a lifetime of slavery without their consent. Also remember, the inflation numbers are way off from the true values. You can't double the price of food and fuel and then say inflation is less than 10. I was recently looking up the cost of living in Nigeria after reading that WorldCoin is paying Nigerians $54 for a retinal scan. $54 $50,000. Sounds pretty good, until I read that eggs cost $1,200, and a nice dinner at a 3-star restaurant costs $20,000. Just chiming in to show how society continues to function even if the numbers get big. You can buy a cute little quaint sign that says milk 25 cents, bread 10 cents, eggs 15 cents from a grocery store 150-ish years ago. I'm sure our advertisements for milk, bread, and eggs at today's prices will be hanging up in some old-fashioned diner-themed restaurant 150 years from now, right between photos of Will Smith and Bart Simpson. In theory, wages are supposed to more or less keep up with inflation. That hasn't happened super consistently, especially over the last 30 years or so, but it has happened and wages are rising. By the time bread costs $10 a loaf, in theory, the average person will look at it the same way that they look at a $3 load of bread today. Wages do rise with inflation, they just don't rise as fast. People in America used to make only a few bucks a week, now they make hundreds. Now if you think $10–15 for a loaf of bread is bad, consider this: at one time in Germany a loaf cost trillions. I kid you not. It's even happened in other countries as well. Inflation is not linear across all items, there are considerations for different segments. For instance, energy costs, heating cooling your home, gas for the car may rise much greater than, say, a dozen eggs. Aggregately, you have inflation, but a particular segment item may seem much higher or much lower. Yes, it will, since there's nothing to back up the currency that's being printed. In the distant future, USA for example can create a new currency measure called neodollar, where it's pegged to the old dollar value, where one neodollar is equal to 100 US dollars. Just pure speculation. Take it with a grain of salt. Yes. And it doesn't matter, really. What counts are the goods and services we make in a given year. Whether you assign the number 10 to that output or the number 1000 is basically not very relevant. Salaries rise also. Otherwise at some point it wouldn't obviously not work out anymore. You only mentioned prices, which isn't off base, but for inflation to happen, salaries also go up. Of course, most people will only ever focus on the cost of something that used to be lower. A Chevy Malibu cost around $4,000 in the 70s. But the median salary was about $11,000, too. If inflation goes slowly enough, then wages will keep up and people don't really notice it too badly, though people on retirement income may have a harder time since it is updated less frequently. It's when inflation is a bit higher that it starts to affect the general population. 2.37% per year maybe? Inflation is compounding. Every year you get a slightly smaller glass of juice from a jug that is also smaller every year. They might add water to make it look like you're getting the same amount of juice, but eventually it will only be water. It's not. Guess how long fiat currencies usually last? The USD. Long does fiat currency last is way overdue. And no one is paying attention. They just want a number to go up instead of buying power to go up. Just considering biodiversity loss, climate change, and our complete dependency on fossil fuels, inflation really isn't a big problem in itself. Our whole society isn't tenable as it is, and we'll run into huge problems long before 100 years. One thing I'm curious about is that what's going to happen when inflation gets so high that we need new currency? Will we just make the numbers bigger and bigger ad infinitum? Or will we do conversion someday? 1 million used equals one new dollar. In a perfect world, well, not perfect, just workable, your salary would roughly keep pace with inflation. So yes, in a few years a loaf of bread might be 10 more expensive along with everything else, but your salary would have increased by 10. Yes, prices continue to go up. So do wages though. Not always at the same rate, but that's a separate discussion. The damage deflation can do to an economy is really bad. So governments deliberately maintain some inflation to avoid it. The most important thing here is real wages, which is the real value of a wage based on how much purchasing power it has. If you have a 5 raise of wages but there's 10 inflation, you've lost 5 of your power real wage. As long as income matches inflation, you wouldn't really notice aside from a few outlier like jewelry. But otherwise it's not tenable over the long run. Either something needs to bring down prices or your money collapses. The short answer is yes. I'm 67 years old and I remember when a pack of cigarettes or a gallon of gas were 29 cents. A soft drink and a bag of chips was 25 cents. A new car was under $2,000. You get the picture. If inflation goes up, Everything goes up so nothing is up. If bread was 50 cents and wages were $1 hour hypothetical and bread is now $5 and the wages are $10 hour. Nothing really changed. Just the numbers. I visited Italy shortly before the transition to the euro and I paid 6,000 lira for some ice cream. Prices are relative. If you stick some zeros on the end of everything, nothing really changes, the numbers just change. The US dollar will be more like yen, where small items can cost in the hundreds of yen for example. But you will also make more money so it equals out allegedly. It's not tenable. 6. Inflation is considered catastrophic after 10 years, and it has been catastrophic, but just for the third world countries. Now it's finally here in the first world. You say that as though $10 for bread decades from now would be crazy. You could get a loaf of bread for under 10 cents a century ago depending on sources. Now it's easily $3, $5. It isn't. People are now poorer on average than they used to be 20 years ago. And it will only get worse. What part of you will own nothing and you will be happy didn't you get? Usually, a war or default happens, and the currency is completely wiped out and a new one takes over. You will not find many examples of currencies that have lasted 200 years. So will bread cost $10,000 in say 500 years? What options do government have to reset the currency to get back to a place where we use reasonable numbers to buy stuff? Keep in mind that currency does not remain the same indefinitely, and very few currencies last even 50 years without some major change in the way they are valued. The TL doctor is eventually you restructure the money system to hack off a zero. So when bread costs $100, you make a new $10 bill that's worth $100 of the old bill.